Like the conference championships to me are so special. But I acknowledge that maybe they're not as important in an expanded playoff field. I get that. Hello and welcome to Always College Football. It is our first episode of the off season. I'm your host, Greg McElroy, and we appreciate you being here with us today. For those of you that are located here in the southern part of the United States, are you as cold as I am? I am freezing. And for whatever reason, I feel like I've been to South Bend, and yes, I know those of you that are listening in an area in which it's like 40 below, if you're in the Dakotas, I know we're soft. I get it. I understand that. I accept that. But I am, even in my house, freezing right now. My heater has been fixed once already. We are struggling down here in the southern part of the United States. But I'll tell you what we have found solace in. Universally, everybody has an opinion on the college football playoff, and we do too. And we are going to walk you through it. And I think this is an appropriate way because I think it puts a bow on the first 12-team playoff. I think it's, by the way, for everybody that's ripping the playoff to shreds, it doesn't need to be ripped to shreds. It needs to be tweaked ever so slightly. That's it. We already have a really good thing. I'm really optimistic about what we've done in year one, and think in time and in learning and in trial and error, we're only going to get better. So I'm super excited about where we're going. I also too, and we're going to do this in the next couple of weeks, I've looked at some way too early top 25s for next year. And if there's one thing I've learned is that there are going to be a lot of teams in rebuild mode next year, including two that played in the national championship. Doesn't mean they can't get back. It just means that there's a lot of really good players that are leaving those programs. So we're about to have a wide open sport, and it feels appropriate to have a 12-team playoff to crown a champion. So we will dive in. Before we do, know that we're going to be here multiple times a week for the next 7 months. We will be here several times a week starting in July and in August. But if you could, tell your friends what we're doing here at Always College Football. Talk to several people, athletic directors, high-level officials at the national championships. Man, we appreciate your podcast so much. You just call balls and strikes. Pretty simple. You call balls and strikes. If it's good, you say it's good. If it's bad, say it's bad. We do not have an agenda here. We purely want to celebrate the sport alongside you guys, because if you're listening to us, you love the sport. So we're going to do it together this offseason, and we're going to be here throughout. If you could, though, rate, and subscribe to the show. The podcast platform is always available to you. And here on the ESPN College Football YouTube channel, if you're watching it, you can check us out there as well. Subscribe to that. We really appreciate it. Our social media channels at Always CFB. We'll have some stuff coming down on social media. We're going to be more active on social media here as we continue to move forward. And then my personal social media is at Greg McElroy. Today, I'm going to tell you how we fix the college football playoff. It's not broken. It doesn't need an overhaul, but it needs some tweaks. And I'll tell you how next on Always College Football. Before we rip it to shreds, let's first start by acknowledging what worked here in the first edition of an expanded field. First thing that worked in the 2024 college football playoff was the fact that we crowned a worthy champion. That is always our number one goal, and we did that again this year. Ohio State was the best team. They were the most talented team. They got hot at the right time. They dominated the competition in each of the 4 games that they played in the playoff. So how did it work? Well, it worked pretty well because the best team won. That's number one. Number two, it worked because the home playoff games were a massive success. And a lot of people, I think, we took for granted that would be a super successful endeavor. In some ways, their teams were playing games in December on actual grass fields. Grass goes dormant in the winter in some places. So I was a little concerned about just the visual of playing on a brown field. That was of concern in the back of my head. I don't know why, because I knew likely that wasn't going to be a problem, but it worked. All the different things, all the different components. You're telling me that we can now host a massive event with about 2 weeks heads up? That was a success. They handled all the tickets. The tickets were sold out. The venues were exciting. There was a time when students weren't on campus, but yet the stadiums were full, and in many cases full of students. Like, it was a really successful endeavor. And I think there were things that were taken for granted a little bit in leading up to those home playoff games that were not necessarily, from a logistics standpoint, the easiest thing to pull off. Well, they did it, and they did so with flying colors. The other thing that worked, I think, and some people might disagree, I think that there were aspects of the playoff that I was concerned with, but representation might have been my biggest concern going into the playoffs. And I know that, hey, I think some people will push back and look at the teams that got it. And some people will say, well, I wish this team would have gotten in. This team should have been in over this team. All that's fine. We're splitting hairs. We're not going to discuss that here today. We're not talking about the criteria of picking playoff teams. That's a conversation for a different day, because I've made my opinions known on the subject. All I want to talk about is the format and the structure of the 12-team playoff. So what I was impressed with and pleased with is that we had teams from every corner of the United States represented in the college football playoff field. We had the West Coast represented with Oregon and Arizona State. We had Texas represented. We had the Midwest represented, obviously, and the Southeast was well represented as well. So we had kind of like all the areas of the playoff, even the Atlantic Coast, if you want to include Clemson to an extent. Like, we had everything accounted for, so it was wide sweeping. It wasn't consolidated. 5 Big Ten, 5 SEC, and a couple from the Midwest, and a couple from here. No, we had really solid spread out representation. So those are 3 things that worked, I think, here in the first edition. Here are the things that didn't work. Okay. Number 1, seeding. Okay. Seeding is a problem. With all due respect to Boise State, and they deserve immense respect for getting to where they got, they had no business being the number 3 overall seed. I'm sorry. It's not being disrespectful of Boise. It's not being disrespectful of the G5. But the G5's path to the college football playoff should absolutely be rewarded with an automatic spot. But what it should not be rewarded with is an automatic bye. We need to take the top 4 seeds and get rid of those go only to conference champions. It doesn't need to be that way. Let's just seed the teams 1 through 12. 1 through 12, and we'll figure it out, right? 4 plays 12, 5 plays 12, 6 plays 11, 7 plays 10, 8 plays 9. Simple as that. And then the top 4 seeds, if they're 3 Big Tens, 1 SEC, they get buys, no problem. If it's Notre Dame, they get a bye, no problem. The top 4 teams get buys regardless of whether or not they won a conference championship. That's kind of universally accepted at this point. I think most people look at this and say, okay, hang on a second. Why is it that a team that lost in the conference championship has a much more challenging situation, even though their schedule was much tougher, their strength of record was much tougher? Why is it that Penn State has to now play a much more difficult road to the championship than Boise? Like, it's ridiculous. It shouldn't happen. It needs to be adjusted. Yes, you win your conference in the G5, you're the top-ranked G5 team, you're in the field for sure, but you are not guaranteed a bye. Simple as that, right? That is pretty self-explanatory. The other thing that did not work is the bye format to begin with. Byes do not favor the teams that received them. They went 0 for 4. And I know some people will say, well, it's about matchup. It's a little bit about this. Those teams really weren't that great to begin with. All that is fine. You can believe that however you want to feel. But it was how they lost that affected my perception of the bye most. It was how Boise State played, for example. The fact that Boise State turned it over 4 times. That was their most in the game all of last season. The fact that Maddox Madsen had 3 picks. He had 3 going into the college football playoff game. The fact that they had 13 penalties. That was their most in the game since 2004. The fact that they missed 2 field goals, right? And there were several special teams issues that plagued all the teams that received byes. Several. Georgia struggled in special teams. They gave up a kick return to the house to open the second half. Texas returned a kick against Arizona State. And there were a handful of other examples in which big plays were made in the margins. Now, Arizona State, they were up to the task, but guess what? They fell into a massive hole early in the game. They fell into a massive hole. They were down 14-0 before you blinked your eyes. Okay? So clearly the teams that had 3.5 weeks to get healthy were at a disadvantage because they're playing against teams that had knocked the rust off 11 days earlier. I think it's very much beneficial to play that first round game at home. That's more advantageous than to receive a first round bye. And people will say, well, hang on a second, you could lose at home. Yeah, you could. You could absolutely lose. But we know buys don't benefit teams. So we should not treat buys as a reward. You know what we should do? Just get rid of buys. Just make it a 16-team playoff and call it a day. That's the easiest thing to do. If we just want to level the playing field, just make sure that team 1 plays the easiest playoff team. That would be the 16 seed. That way no one has buys. Everyone's playing that first round. And everyone, hopefully, the top teams will have a pretty significant advantage over the teams that they might play on the other side. Oregon, for example, the best team in the country all season long, right? The most flawless. They were undefeated, unblemished, had won with offense, had won with defense. Well, they got down in about 2 seconds. They gave up 4 touchdowns of 40-plus yards in the first half by itself. That was their most given up in a single half of football in 20 years. Okay? And we are talking, whether it's Boise's penalties or the big plays given up by Oregon, like we are talking very uncharacteristic mistakes made by teams that received buys. So we got to get rid of them because it does not need to be used against you if it's supposed to be a reward. One thing we also need to acknowledge is that New Year's 6 games are always going to be a part of the postseason, okay? So those that say, well, we got to get rid of New Year's 6 games and play all these games at home, it's probably not going to happen. Why? Because these New Year's 6 games are part of the fabric. Everyone that's in charge in a leadership position in college football, they understand that the bowl system is part of the fabric that has made the college football world as popular as it's made them. So for those of you that are suggesting, we'll just play all these games at home, do this, do that, well, that's not going to happen, at least not in the near term, because these bowl sites are too important, they're too valuable, and they carry too much power. So that's not going to happen. Part of the fabric of our sport, and I think it's something that we need to acknowledge. Okay, but how do we tweak some of the things that went down this past weekend? Or excuse me, the past 6 or 7 weekends. I've already told you what worked. I've already told you what didn't work. Other than that, it's pretty dang seamless, in my opinion. Bowls didn't work. Seeding didn't work. Buys didn't work. Seeding didn't work. But everything else was pretty good. Was it not? Like, I thought it was pretty good. If you guys disagree, that's fine. You can say, well, competitive matchups. We want more competitive matchups. You can't control that. Like, it's not up to us as people that consume the sport to expect teams to put their best foot forward. Like, those of you that watch the NFL is supposed to be the most competitive landscape of football. Well, did you watch the first round of the playoffs this year? Like, did you see the Denver Broncos play the Buffalo Bills? Like, did you see how one-sided almost every game was, with the exception of the game involving the Commanders and the Buccaneers? Like, we can't control whether or not teams show up. All we can control is the format to give teams an advantage to play at their very best, okay? So here's how we tweak it, and here's what I propose. A lot of people are saying get rid of conference championships. I think that would make a lot of sense. If you want me to be honest, I have always been a traditionalist. I love conference championship games. Conference championship Saturday has always been of significant importance to me. In my career, I was the SEC championship game MVP. It was the best game I ever played. We beat Florida, and it was my favorite moment as a college player, even more so than winning the national championship 4 or 5 weeks later. Like, the conference championships to me are so special. But I acknowledge that maybe they're not as important in an expanded playoff field. I get that. But we are going to operate under the assumption right now that the conference championship games are still in existence when I lay out the format that's going to work for college football here in the foreseeable future. Here's how we do it. No buys, but we still reward conference champions. Still going to appreciate those teams that won their conference. But the two conferences that are clearly above all else in the eyes of many, I think the Big Ten and the SEC are the two best. You might disagree. You might think the ACC is. In some years, it might very well be. The Big 12, maybe you think they're the very best. Fine with that. But the SEC and the Big Ten carry the most power, and they're the deepest leagues. So the reward for winning the SEC and the Big Ten should be higher than that of the reward for winning the ACC and the Big 12. If you disagree with that, that's fine. We can just agree to disagree. It's all good. SEC champion, Big Ten champion will be seeded number 1 and number 2. Doesn't matter what order. We're splitting hairs. Okay? Those will be 1 and 2 every single year. Then we will seed the rest of the teams in whatever order the committee likes to seed them in, 3 through 16. So just straight down the list. SEC and Big Ten are 1 and 2. Whatever order they're in, doesn't really matter. 3 through 16 are seeded according to the College Football Playoff Committee. Here's how the matchups are going to work. That first round, still going to involve home games. So what we're going to do, we are going to have 6 home games out of 8 in the first round. You're going to say, hang on a second, wait, what? I'll explain. Just bear with me for half a moment, okay? We will use last year's College Football Playoff Committee rankings to help illustrate what this playoff format would look like. So if we use last year's rankings, here's how it would look. Number 16 Clemson, winners of the ACC, would travel to Oregon to play in the first round. Number 2, number 15 South Carolina would travel to Georgia to play in the first round. Ole Miss is at Texas. That's 14-3. Miami is at Penn State. That's 13-4. Arizona State, the 12 seed, is at Notre Dame. That's 12-5. And then Alabama at Ohio State. That's 11-6. Those are your home games. The reward for being a top 6 team is that you get a home playoff game against teams 16 through 11. All good, right? Now you're going to wonder, what is the next 2? Why are the next 2 played at neutral sites? Well, because we have to protect the New Year's 6 bowl sites. All right? So that means 10 against 7 will be played in a geographical location that makes the most sense to the highest seed. In this case, it's SMU, the 10 seed, is playing against Tennessee, the 7 seed, in the Peach Bowl. So those 2 teams would go to the Peach Bowl. They'd play on the neutral site. You're asking why? I'll explain here in just a minute. Number 8, Indiana, would play against number 9, Boise State. They would play this game in the Fiesta Bowl. So the Peach and the Fiesta would host neutral site first round games. And then the top 6 seeds would get to host teams 16 through 11 on their home field. Good? Awesome. On to the next round. This is where it starts to get interesting. I just told you that bye weeks work against you, right? Well, we got rid of byes, so we've alleviated that problem. But, man, the reward for winning the SEC and the Big Ten is you get a home game against the 16 and the 15 seed. That's all you get? No, not in this format. That's what makes this format special. If you win the SEC and you win the Big Ten, your reward for winning their conference championship is not 1 home playoff game, but you now get 2 home playoff games. Right? Mind-blowing. You get 2 home playoff games? Like, that's enormous. Look at the advantages that the teams had hosting teams on their home field in the first round this past year. Like, those games weren't overly competitive, were they? Why? Because it's really hard to go on the road in college football and get a win, especially against an engaged home field crowd and against a team that is really talented. Because if you're winning the Big Ten or the SEC, you're probably outrageously talented. So the winners of those 2 leagues, because those are the toughest leagues, they get home field advantages in the first round and the second round. So assuming chalk flies, and that's what we're going to use. We're going to say chalk flies in these scenarios. Guess what? Oregon, who is the number 1 overall seed, they beat Clemson in the first round in Eugene, right? Awesome. That means they now are at home again, playing the winner of the 8-9 matchup, this being Indiana or Boise State, who just played at a New Year's Six bowl site. So let's say Boise State beat Indiana. They're in the Fiesta Bowl. Well, the winner of the Fiesta Bowl now has to go to Autzen to play against the Oregon Ducks in the second round of the playoffs. Catching my drift? Well, Georgia, they're the number 2 overall seed, right? They beat South Carolina in the first round of the college football playoff in our format, which means, guess what? They now get to host the winner of the Peach Bowl, SMU and Tennessee. Let's just assume Tennessee wins that game. So Tennessee is now at Georgia in the second round of the playoff. As opposed to having Tennessee play Georgia in the Sugar Bowl, no, now Tennessee, congrats, you're a 10 seed, you're in the field, you control your own destiny, but it just became a lot tougher. You now have to go to Athens to face the Dogs. All right, so Oregon's at home, Georgia's at home in the second round, hosting the winners of 2 first-round New Year's Six bowl games. And then you look at the other 2 quarterfinal games, those will be New Year's Six. So the winner of the 3 versus 14 gets the winner of the 6 versus 11. The highest seeded team gets geographical advantage. And in this case, if chalk flies, that means Texas, who's the 3 seed, they choose the Sugar, and they get to take on, the winner of Alabama and Ohio State. Okay, Texas plays Ole Miss in the first round. They beat Ole Miss. Now they take on the winner of Alabama and Ohio State. Let's just say Ohio State wins that game. Texas against Ohio State, they're in the Sugar Bowl because Texas is the number 3, gets the geographical advantage. They choose New Orleans. They host the Big Ten team down south. The other game, the winner of the 4 versus 13, so that'd be Miami and Penn State, takes on the winner of the 5-12. That'd be Notre Dame and Arizona State. They're going to play in the Rose Bowl in this scenario. Okay? Number 3, Texas chooses Sugar. Whatever's left over goes to the Rose. Pretty amazing setup, right? That's how that would all work out. You're probably wondering, well, what if the 16 seed beats the 1 seed? What if Clemson somehow shocks the world in the first round and beats Oregon in the first round of the playoff? Great. Guess who gets the top 2 home playoff games now? The number 2 and the number 3. Well, the 1 and the 2 seed both lose. Perfect. Guess who gets the home playoff games in the second round? The 3 and the 4. Well, the first seed won, but the second seed lost at the 15, so South Carolina beat Georgia. How about that? Well, guess what? That means that the home playoff game in the round 2 now goes to 1 and 3. Catching my drift? So the highest 2 remaining seeds after the first round get that home playoff game, while still protecting the New Year's Six bowl games. You have 2 in the first round, you have 2 in the second round, and then you have 2 in the semifinals. The winners would advance. You kind of understand it from this point forward. You win those quarterfinal games, you now go play in a neutral site. In this case, it's Orange and Cotton. Using last year's bowl games as an example, winners will then compete for the national championship. Tell me your thoughts on it, because I've thought about this a lot, and I've had a lot of people say, well, we need to get rid of buys. Oh, well, we need to expand to 14 and give those first 2 teams buys because they win the Big Ten and the SEC. All that's great. To me, I just want to see more home playoff games. I want to see us seed the field appropriately, and I want to see the number 1 and number 2 team, the champions of the Big Ten and the SEC, rewarded for having run and survived the gauntlet of playing in that league on an annual basis. Okay, we'll pay it off with this, and everybody's got an opinion on college football playoff, and this, I'm just giving you mine. I think that format makes sense. Okay, you reward the top 2 seeds with multiple home playoff games. You still protect the 6 bowl games that are the highest grossing from a revenue standpoint. I think it makes sense. I love that format. If that's what we adopt, I hope we do. If any of the commissioners want to talk through it, I'm happy to do it. What I will not weigh in on are when the games are played. I'm not a programming expert, okay? It's not my cup of tea. I know ball. I know TV. I know enough to be dangerous. I also know that most of you that are consuming the sport, you're just watching the sport because you love the sport. Like, having an audience of 17 million doesn't affect you. I mean, the fact that Penn State and SMU did not do a gigantic number doesn't affect you, doesn't affect me. I was watching it either way. The fact that these games are traditionally going to perform better on January 1st doesn't affect you. It does affect me because I work in television. But guess what? A very, very small percentage of us work in television. So I don't really have the answer for when the game should be played. A lot of people are saying the playoffs just way too long. To be honest with you, I didn't mind it. I'm going to watch college football regardless. So having games on the 20th, having games on the 1st, having games on the 8th and 9th or 9th and 10th, and then a game on the 20th doesn't bother me that bad. But if it does you, then I'm all for listening and trying to change. A lot of people say, well, we don't want games during the week. I understand that. I very much understand that, but I also don't think us as consumers of the sport want to go head to head with the NFL either. We need to acknowledge that the NFL is the king from a viewership standpoint, and it's hard to compete there. But if you'd prefer to just have the games on Saturdays, and hey, if the games are on Saturdays up against the NFL, I'm probably watching college football. If that's your thought process, that's awesome. But I don't know if that's the thought process for many. And the goal is to grow. The goal is to continue to grow and accelerate, and we'll see where we go from here. But if you want to basically take the conference championship games and then make conference championship weekend into the first round of the playoffs, and the week after that's the second round of the playoffs, then the third round of the playoffs is the first weekend or the weekend before Christmas, and then the national championship is played on January 1st, that's fine. I got no problem with that. But if you also need to acknowledge that maybe we won't always crown a worthy champion in that scenario, because if guys are banged up and they miss time, and a couple extra days rest would allow them just enough time for them to get healthy and be available as compared to being out, that's something I think worth weighing in as well. So I'll be curious, and I look forward to reading the comments. I don't read the comments as rigorously as I probably should, but on this show I will, because I really think it matters. Like, our goal as a sport, and I'm speaking not just as a consumer of the sport, but as someone that works on the sport and wants to see the sport grow and continue to gain in popularity and to continue momentum. Like, I am invested in the sport, so are you. And I want to do what's right by you. And we all have opinions on this. What are yours? I'm going to go through the comments, and maybe if you have some questions, we can address them on Monday's episode of Always College Football. So we hope that you appreciated the perspective. We hope that you appreciated and are open-minded to the format that I presented, because I think it'd be pretty cool to see multiple rounds at home without sacrificing the neutral site bowl games that I know just have so much power that are just not likely going away. So let us know what you think. We look forward to continuing our conversation with you. We have a lot to look forward to here over the next couple of weeks as well. We will continue to put a bow on last year and then look forward to this upcoming year. We'll do some evaluations. Maybe next week we dive into playoff teams for next year. Maybe some under-the-radar teams that are kind of flying under the radar. We see everybody's got their way too early top 25s out. Maybe we do our own version of that, but we give you the top 12 because it's a 12-team playoff after all. So for all of us here at Always College Football, for Mark, Jake, Jack, the other Jack, I'm Greg. We hope you have an amazing day, and remember, it's always college football. Hey guys, it's Greg McElroy. Thanks for watching Always College Football. Make sure you like, rate, and subscribe to ESPN's YouTube channel and wherever you listen to your podcasts.